As we move on, we're going to hear from Ms. Nakisa Glover, our next witness, the founder of Soul Nation and a wonderful local activist. She'll be introduced by Mayor Jennifer Roberts.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Roberts, and it is my honor today to introduce you to a leader in the environmental justice and climate justice area here in Charlotte, and that is Nakisa Glover. She has been active for a number of years in helping tell the story of environmental justice and environmental racism. She has served as the regional director for the League of Conservation Voters. She's been the climate justice organizer for the Hip Hop Caucus, still doing that, and also has worked with Girls Who Code. So she's got the technology piece as well. She has a bachelor in science from UNC Charlotte. She's also been a volunteer in groups like the Moms Clean Air Force and Greenpeace, but her big accomplishment is founding Soul Nation, and that's spelled S-O-L Nation, in 2018. It is described on the website as Black thought leaders who are closing the green gap and placing people of color at the core of the environmental justice work. And so it is my honor to introduce you to Nakisa and to hear her story of environmental racism and the justice that she's working for. Nakisa, great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me today, Jennifer. And thank you for the lovely introduction. When I was able to find my next opportunity, it actually came in the form of an opportunity that I didn't realize would be what would set me on a trajectory to understand the work towards advocating for our communities and advocating for justice, and specifically environmental justice in our communities. That path would lead me to learn of the environmental movement overall. But what I would learn in the environmental movement space is that there are forms of disparity and injustice there as well. What I've come to know is that some of our big green organizations, the environmental movement itself is a movement of many different organizations, but the mainstream movement is well funded and it's white led. In this white led movement, it gets a lot of funding, but yet we have communities that are continuously harmed by the injustices of pollution. They're harmed by the disparities of access to clean water. They are disparaged because of different environmental factors that become cumulative impacts. And these cumulative factors really take a toll on people's lives. And so navigating further into the work in the environmental space. I knew for me that I needed to land somewhere where I was able to make the connections between the environmental movement and the social justice movement, because we understand that the environmental movement and the social justice movement both need each other. And the issue there arises because the same communities that are typically Black and brown, that are on the bottom of every environmental impact list that you can think of, are the same communities that are on the bottom of the list of our social issues. When we talk about the digital divides, or we talk about housing access or food security, we talk about education, like all of these different things, they have a face and a color to them. And that face and color typically looks like mine. Black and brown communities are most likely impacted by environmental threats and most likely impacted by social threats as well. And so while I wasn't finding that in some of the earlier work in my path, I was able to ultimately navigate to a place where I could really do this deep, impactful, meaningful work for climate justice through Soul Nation. And to your point, Soul Nation is a climate justice solutions-based organization where we are really truly committed to closing the green gap that exists for our communities. We believe that communities should own their own solutions. We believe that that we need to create those pathways and entry points for Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities to be able to be active participants in the environmental justice movement. We also believe that we should really create the access for communities to be able to lead and participate in the socioeconomic decision making and development to create their own sustainable and sovereign communities. I'm going to talk about climate and environment as a whole. We're seeing the mainstream media talk about one, they're using the word climate. We had a whole administration that was denying the impacts of climate. So we do have in more spaces where people are using the terms in the ways in which and connecting it to the ways that it's impacting our everyday lived experience. So we are connecting the colonial pipeline oil spill that's getting local attention. Now, I think there's an opportunity for there to be mainstream media attention on something like that when we know that everybody now knows what colonial pipeline is, because we were all impacted by the ransomware attack that they were under earlier this year. And so being able to connect the dots between not only have we been impacted because of failures of their infrastructure to prevent the ransomware attacks, there also is the failure of their infrastructure because we know that pipelines leak. And typically pipelines are leaking most often in Black and Brown communities, specifically in Indigenous communities as well. And it threatens our access to clean water. And so I think those are the opportunities where we're seeing the opportunity to really leverage those moments and create more dialogue around these issues as not being something that that just fell out the sky from nowhere. No, all of the issues, from the respiratory disease, the asthma, the cancers, many of these things have a root back to the pollution that is invading our communities.
So, Nakisha, it's unusual for a woman and a person of color to head an environmental organization. And I know that, you've got to talk to business leaders, et cetera, in your role. Do you find that you're treated any differently because of who you are?
I think representing my community, I think there have been times where it does present itself as challenges. And it really comes down to it when we talk about the work that we're doing in our communities. Black-led organizations working on climate and Black people working on climate and environmental issues are underfunded, under-resourced, and overburdened by the issues that pertain to the environmental and climate space. And yet they are the most far away from really being able to have that access to the resources, the infrastructure, the education, and the power to make change. Yet they're the closest to the issues. And so while I may be making progress, I as an individual may be making progress, the larger community is not, because there is a hoarding of the access to those things that I mentioned, a hoarding of the access to the infrastructure, the education, the power, and the resources. When we know that communities who have been most impacted by environmental threats are the closest to the solutions and should be resourced in a way in which they can be able to own their own solutions for their communities. And so, yes, it may seem at times that I'm able to make progress, but that's been a journey, Jennifer. Like the journey of getting to a place where Soul Nation does have some funding. We are able to hire some staff. It doesn't compare to the larger organizations that are gaining multi-year, multi-million dollars in funding. And we need more organizations that are led by people who look like me and look like the communities in which Soul Nation is serving and represented in. We need more of those communities to be represented in the spaces that can actually put forth that transformational change, where they can be able to really see sustainable and regenerative communities that they desire. We all desire to live in sustainable and regenerative communities, but some people in our community have more access to the things to generate those sustainable and regenerative communities.
So if there were one or two things that you would put at the top of the list to change right now to help communities that have been impacted, communities of color that have been impacted, and to change the racism inherent in the way that we deal with the environment, what would those priorities be?
I think I'm gonna sum it up in those four buckets that I mentioned, because that's also the way that we define green gap. So let me actually take a minute to define green gap. I think for us, like, the focus should be on closing the green gap. And at Soul Nation, we define green gap as the difference between Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities' desire to build and live in sustainable, regenerative communities, and their access to the resources, the power, the education, and the infrastructure to achieve those communities. So no matter what policy that we're talking about, no matter what resources we're talking about, what it comes down to is being able to identify those gaps where they exist and being able to close the gaps by creating more pathways to resources. Some of us that may be watching today, you have access to, and you have not only access, you may have an overabundance of resources and power and infrastructure and education that we need to figure out how do we redistribute those things so that communities can really be able to stand on their own and be able to have the clean air and the clean water, and the infrastructure in their communities to really thrive, and be able to also take part as active participants in the transition that we're making as we're divesting from fossil fuels and old technologies that have harmed our communities, and we're making more investments into clean energy and infrastructure, really being able to have communities who have been most harmed be able to most benefit from the trajectory that we're on, for a more cleaner, renewable economy.
Well, Nakisha, you've been tremendous today. I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for your passion and all the work that you're doing for our communities of color, because we know they have been harmed, and it's in all of our desires and best interests to help close that, as you call it, the green gap, and to help people be more aware of how they can be part of that. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Wonderful to hear from you, Nakisha Glover, and Jennifer Roberts. Thank you so much for your questioning of her. Our affirming witness tonight for Nakisha will be none other than Joel Segal. Joel Segal, I turn it over to you.
Yeah, hi everyone. Happy holidays. It's great to see Nakisha. I remember I met her at UNCC when she was working for a national green organization, and I felt her spirit and her warmth. And as I got to talk to her, I realized I was dealing with a very brilliant woman who I thought would become a major leader in the climate change space. And I think I was right. And I invited her to New York City for the Justice Action Mobilization Network National Conference. And I was blown away by her, I'll just say her genius, and also her spirituality. what Nakisha's been saying about African-American environmental groups being underfunded, I have heard this repeatedly over the last several years. Reverend Leo Woodbury in Florence, South Carolina, what he tells me is that most of the money goes to the green organizations, the larger green organizations. But I think there has to be a sea change in terms of where the funding goes. And Nakisha's right. There's no reason why organizations like Soul Nation, I remember when she first launched Soul Nation, should be resourced, to the maximum degree. Out west, I just came back from Albuquerque, New Mexico. Out west, the people suffering the most from climate change are the Latino farmers and farmers from ethnic communities. They can't get water from their wells because the aquifers have dried up. So Nakisha, thank you for your honesty. And I am so glad that Nakisha's in this world, because we have one real fighter for social justice, environmental justice, and humanity. She's also one of the nicest persons that I've ever known.
Thank you so much, Joel Segal. I appreciate your words of support for Nakisha Glover and her work.